Hello everybody and welcome to another video. This one is going to be a long one, especially for this channel. So let's not waste any time and get stuck in. So I was lucky enough to win a raffle last year at one of winter's events, and I won this Cerastus Knight Acheron that's been sat in my cupboard since, and I think it's finally time that I get to it and make something that I can be proud of. As many of you will know, I have multiple armies and I wanted this to be fielded as an ally to many of them, so I thought I'd put it in a cool pose and do some fun stuff with the base and also the heraldry on it to make it fit in with quite a few of my armies. The pose that I had in mind was with one leg raised up on top of some ruins and an arm pointing out, preferably the arm with the big chainsword on. So the first thing to do was change these legs by cutting away part of the tab so the knees could bend a bit further than normal. Throughout the process I was constantly dry fitting the legs and making sure that the pistons all fit together nicely to make sure I didn't have to do anything absolutely crazy with regards to the kit bash. The only thing that I had to do that wasn't in the instructions was change the way this piston connected to the hips, and the way I did that was by using a toothpick. My plan, though it ended up taking quite a while to complete because I'm really clumsy and kept dropping it, was to cut the toothpick down as it's about the same size as the plastic rod that already exists, superglue it together and therefore extend the piston out slightly so there wouldn't be a massive gap between the end of the piston and the socket it's supposed to sit in. After quite a bit of trial and error, which included losing the first toothpick inside the socket, having to recut another bit, getting it stuck to my fingers, as evidenced here, and all round just being clumsy and dropping things, I did manage to make this work. There's definitely a better way to do it, just use some plastic rod instead of the idiocy that I'm doing here, but I didn't think of that. Anyway, long story short, this is the sloppiest part of the entire build, but unless you're looking for it, and now I've called it out you might be, you probably wouldn't notice it. The next thing I did was start the posing on the base, and I wanted to raise the leg up as mentioned, so I got this cool piece of scenery from marchofwar.com, linked in the description. This little rubble ruin base thing is very similar to how my sisters and Black Templars are based, so I immediately tied this knight in with them. The first thing I did was dry fit as you've just seen and then glue the raised foot on top of a bit of the rubble. Throughout this process I'm using super glue as I'm attaching plastic to resin and normal plastic glue won't work, and I'm also using some activator that comes in a spray can. I got these from Amazon, I don't know which specific ones they are but they were cheap, so just go on Amazon and you'll find something like it. Once the legs were attached to the feet and everything was stable on the base, I started adding in all the extra support structure around the legs. This is a really satisfying model to build. Apparently the old resin one was quite difficult and had a lot of issues where you had to cut the rods down to size, but they've definitely made some improvements to this kit and I really enjoyed the entire process. Skipping forward to another key feature of the pose, I wanted to have this chainsword arm outstretched, so I built it as per the instructions and then used some super glue to make it rigid and stick in a certain pose. This kit is really poseable and really dynamic, so you can do loads with it, so normally I probably wouldn't glue it like this, but whenever it comes to building big stompy robots I always have a very specific pose in mind, much like my Brutalis Dreadnought that I kit bashed out of a knight, linked in the top right, and I glue everything into one pose because I'd rather have one awesome looking model than one that's kind of a bit floppy. As always, there's no right or wrong answer, you can do whatever you want with your models, I just prefer to do it this way. So with the right arm now glued in place with plenty of super glue to help support it, I moved on to the left arm and just made sure that everything was fitting nicely. I should also note that building the flame cannon was really satisfying with that big chain around the back. It took a while, but it looks super cool. After the arms were attached, you can see I started to dry fit things again to see how the entire model would pose together, and then I went back to the instructions to start putting together the little pilot, which I did decide in the end to paint. I also made sure that when I'd finally built the model I didn't glue the top canopy down, so if I ever want to check in on him and see how he's doing, I can. Another awesome dopamine hit you get whilst building this model is the satisfaction of slotting the cockpit into the main body. I don't know if this is unique to the Cerastus class knights or if the Questores class ones do it too, but it's just lovely. The final part to do on this top half of the body is to add the head, which I wanted looking off in the direction of the point, but I left it loose so I could move it around. I had no problem with that being non-fixed. Now the top half is quite heavy and it only attaches via this ball joint, so whilst very posable, it's not necessarily very strong. So using a bunch of super glue and a toothpick, again, you can use metal rod or plasticard here, both are also fine, but in this case the toothpick also works. I glued everything together and I know now it's safe from ever snapping off, unless I'm really trying. Moving down to the middle of the body, I finished off building up the flame cannon and I wanted it hanging down by his side, but not loosely or limply. I wanted it slightly more dynamic, so I used some super glue to push it out and away from the body to suit his quite dynamic pose. Next I went back to the base and added a bit more March of War terrain in the form of a slightly taller column piece, just to add some depth and also a bit of height to the base. The final part that I'm going to be doing on the base for now is adding some texture paste to make it look like it's a bunch of ruined rubble on the floor, and this mud paste is perfect for that. My overall plan for the base is to have it a mix of two of my armies, but then filled in with whatever I like, and have the Sisters of Battle style base on the left with the ruined sanctuary, and then a lava field on the right so we can run with my salamanders. The idea being that it's a sanctuary that's cracking and falling into lava as a planet breaks apart, which, if you know anything about the lore of my various armies that I fielded over on Winter's channel, that'll make sense. Now, as you've just seen, I kept the armor plates separate so I could paint them in a different colour to the main endoskeleton. So what I did is went and sprayed this guy black and the rest of it white, and we'll come back to them soon. Now, to do some really easy metal effects and get this body done rather quickly, I'm using a dry brush of steel from Vallejo. For dry brushing metallics, I'd use a big cheap brush like I am. This is just a makeup brush from a set off of Amazon. Once again, bought it years ago, and I just use it for these messy projects. After the initial dry brush was done, I went back in with my brush and the same colour just to smooth out a few areas because I don't want this to be too dirty. I want it to be a nice, well-maintained, clean knight who's just arrived to reinforce my various armies. Once I've smoothed out a few of those rough areas, whilst leaving a fair bit of black in the recess because it looks good and is easy shading, I went back in with dark aluminium, also from Vallejo, and did the exact same process with the smoothing out on the other side. If you want to push this even further, I'd recommend silver from Vallejo. I think I did add a little bit in the long run, but didn't necessarily film it as it was only a tiny amount. I didn't want this skeleton to be too bright, otherwise it would overpower the rest of the model. I then went in with a normal brush and a bunch of Nuln Oil just to get a nice bit of depth into those areas that I'd covered over. I'm not sure if the Nuln Oil is strictly necessary at this stage, given the fact we started with a black base coat and a lot of that is still showing due to the painting methods we used, but I went for it anyway. There's really no harm in it, but if you want to skip it, you can. Next up was a bit of Black Legion contrast paint to put all over the exposed piping and wiring that's all over the model. After this step was complete, I went in with some various other shades, namely Agrax Earthshade and a little bit of Seraphim Sepia and Reichland Fleshshade, just to add a few greasy areas around the pistons, those parts that probably have to be pretty well lubricated to work properly on a machine this size. Using the shades and completing this whole skeleton is always really simple and easy, and also really satisfying because you feel like you get a massive part of the model done very quickly. The next step that I did was make things a little bit brighter and add a bit of colour to it by adding Achillean green contrast paint, heavily thin with water, in all those areas where the Nuln Oil started to seep in. The idea being that there's some sky reflections or perhaps some blue armour reflections, or, as you'll see in a bit, the base is slightly blue, so some reflections from the light bouncing off the ground, things like that. I just think this is really cool to add a bit of blue to these dark metallic colours, or even bright metallic colours. If you want to know a little bit more about this, I have an in-depth guide on painting nice shiny steel, and I painted some Bretonians recently, and that's linked in the top right. I do think this is a really satisfying process, and of course entirely optional, but if you feel confident to do it, you don't have to do it with blue, you can do it with reds, Perhaps I should have, given there's going to be lava on the base, but at this time I was just keeping it all blue. It's a really nice way to add some colour, depth and interest to what would otherwise be quite a monotone model. Now that's most of the endoskeleton now done, and we can start to move to the armour panels, starting with those that are still attached to the knight, the ones that I couldn't remove on the weapon arms. I'm using some pale grey blue from Vallejo just for these initial plates. For the rest of the armour plates that aren't attached, I'll be using a slightly different colour, but you can't really tell the difference. Normally I wouldn't recommend painting white over black, but this colour is genuinely amazing and it only took 2 or 3 coats, which if you normally consider how white goes over black, that's actually quite amazing. I did this all over the chainsword and half of all the armour panels, because I'm going to be going for a halved / slightly quartered scheme. So for this initial scheme, I focused on the right arm at the point facing the viewer, as you can see it now, on the left weapon arm inside towards the body, that'll make sense when you see it, and the left leg. The scheme will really start to become apparent in the near future, and I'll also show you one of my other little models that will help it make more sense. After those initial white areas were done, I switched to a really nice rich blue in the form of Cantor blue from GW. I love this colour, it's really bright and royal and very saturated, and I use it for my Crimson Fists and loads of other things besides. If you haven't used this paint before, I can highly recommend it, especially if you're going to highlight it in the same way I am. So as promised, here's the inspiration for the scheme. It's a little Adeptus Titanicus Warhound I painted a while back. I actually painted him on the channel, so once again I'm shilling myself today, but there's a link in the top right. This guy is the inspiration for the knight, and it's really cool to replicate it in macro scale, even though it's a miniature. So as mentioned, I took away the arm panels to paint separately, and that's so I could spray them with Ghoul Grey from Colourforge, which is basically the equivalent of a GW white spray, which the name I can't actually quite remember right now. So I started by spraying it with Ghoul Grey, and then my plan was to use Tempest Blue, which is very similar to Cantor Blue, to do the other half. I used masking tape to show roughly where the halves should be on these plates, and then I sprayed it white again to make sure that there was no overspray before going in with my blue. And I think this did help, because it meant that whilst the lines weren't perfectly straight, it still looked pretty good. And as always, it's great peeling off masking tape and seeing the work, as evidenced here. So yes, it's not perfectly neat, but to be honest, my straight lines freehanding with the brush probably aren't that neat either, and it's all going to come out in the wash anyway as we add highlights and shading. Plus, this saved me an absolute ton of time. If you're ever looking for the best spray cans ever, seriously, recommend Colourforge. They absolutely do not sponsor the channel, and they don't know I exist. I'm tiny. I'm saying that they're great because I use them, and they're great. Now onto the laborious process of recess shading and highlighting. I'm going to show you how I did it on this one panel, and then we'll skip all the others because you don't want to watch me do 20 odd panels over and over again. This is actually quite an easy process because there's some clearly defined lines in there, so as long as you have a little bit of brush control and you're patient, you can do this quite easily. I'm using Black Templar for all the recess shading, and then for my blue highlights I'm using Lothern Blue. The key part of doing these highlights isn't just outlining all the panels as you'd expect, but it's also to draw a nice thin line around where the two colours meet. This is to firstly disguise where the lines are a slight bit wobbly, which is always useful, but it also really shows a really bright change between the two colours, and I just think it looks cool. For the other half, I'm using Silver Grey from AK, which again is a really nice bright white paint and is perfect for highlighting Ghoul Grey when it's sprayed on, or the previous grey that I mentioned, Pale Grey Blue, when it's been painted on. The key part about being able to paint things like this, aside from patience and practice, is honestly just having good paints, and then you're winning half the battle because you're not struggling against poor pigment coverage. Speaking of great paints, one of the best ones I can think of out there for doing metallics in a gold colour is Duncan Rhodes' Two Thin Coats range. This is Dragon's Gold. It's absolutely amazing. It's basically colour matched to Retributor Gold from GW, but I find those pots always dry out, so I'm slowly moving away from them. This comes in a little drop bottle. You just got to shake it up and don't hold it exactly upside down because there's a little ball in there and it can get stuck in the nozzle. So just hold it sideways when you squeeze it out. Don't let it explode on you. But as you can see, it's doing lovely one coat gold. On some of the larger areas, I add a second coat just to be safe, but I've generally found with Duncan's Two Thin Coats range, you often only need one coat. That's how good they are. And whilst we're on the subject of metallics, I'm using some top brass from Duncan Rhodes, which is the same as Runelord brass from GW, to add a few different colours all over that endoskeleton. Whilst everything's drying, I'm going to go back in and paint the eyes. I painted these white earlier, you didn't see that, and there's a few lenses on the back I did the same thing with, and I'm just using Warp Lightning contrast paint from Games Workshop to make them a nice green. Green isn't heavily present on this model, so it's a really good spot colour. And with that, the model is mostly painted. There's a few little bits to do, including the pilot, but now we can get on to another really fun bit, and that's assembling everything. Oh yeah, we're really starting to look good now. However, I did make one small mistake. As I went to attach the two chest plates, I realised that what was supposed to be this blue side for the blue half of the model actually turned out to be on the wrong side, so I had to flip it. Luckily, being a slightly half, slightly quartered scheme, it didn't make much difference, but I really need to plan better in future because that could have been really bad if I've just gone for straight halves down the middle. Luckily, I hadn't. But with everything attached, our knight is starting to look absolutely amazing, and I'm genuinely stoked at how well those layers came out and how beautiful the colours ended up looking. Going off of that high, I decided to do quite a fiddly bit and paint the little pilot. He turned out to be quite simple, just doing the same half scheme as I did above, but I painted him and it's a nice little thing to have hidden under the cockpit. I also painted all the lenses at the same time using the same method as I had on the eyes, but instead of just green, I also added some Bile Red, which is nice saturated contrast paint, some Achillean Green, and some Pterodon Turquoise. Plus a tiny bit of Imperial Fist, just for more colours. Otherwise, he was painted exactly the same using the same highlight colours and the same metallic trim. The only difference is that I highlighted all the control panels in Basalt Grey from AK. Again, there's not much black elsewhere on the main knight, so this is unique to inside the cockpit. Back to the metallics briefly, I'm going to highlight all of that gold using Vallejo Gold, which is very bright, and I'm just going over the large panels mainly. I'm not highlighting absolutely everything because being a true metallic paint, everything's already pretty shiny. One thing I'd forgotten to mention is I also did a little bit of Reikland Flesh Shade over a few key areas on the gold where there were large recesses or large flat panels that needed a bit of depth. It doesn't look like I filmed this and I don't know why, but trust me, you should always add a little bit of shade to the gold. Reikland Flesh Shade is one of the best. Going back to another piece that hadn't been painted yet, I added a few details to the little banner that hangs between his legs.
Stands back. I'm gonna put my moves on her.
Adding the metallic paints, and then deciding to go with Avalanche Sunset as a nice yellow. I could have also gone for the gold, but it didn't feel right to have such a shiny metallic gold on a banner, a fabric thing like this. Though of course it could have been gold leaf or something, but instead I just went for a yellow paint and it worked absolutely fine. I decided they needed to be a little bit more colour over a few areas of the knight, so on both these exhausts and on the big Flamestorm cannon, I added some Seraphim Sepia, Agrax Shade, and a little bit of Druchii Violet to make it look like there was a bit of heat bloom or burn. It's a bit cartoony, but I think it looks cool. Next up, one of the parts I was really looking forward to is the transfers, and I'm going to be using these in the bottom right. They look really cool and super knightly, and I'm definitely also going to be keeping some for my Bretonnians for the old world. This guy is absolutely a custom knightly house for 40k and potentially 30k, but I'm using the house Cold Shroud transfers because A, they look cool, B, Cold Shroud is a cool name, and C, they look cool. Can I say that twice? Anyway, using the tried and true micro-sol, micro-set method, I added a bunch of transfers all over the model, including some text and an Aquila to the banner. There are also a few other transfers that I wanted to add from other ranges to tie him into my armies, namely some Sisters of Battle transfers, some Templars transfers, and a couple of Salamanders ones. So I added those to the leg, and then I went back to the Knight's transfer sheet to add some of these cool red stripes, which I cut to shape and attached to various areas across the Knight. I do have to say that I think Games Workshop's transfer game has been absolutely incredible lately. These ones in this Knight kit are absolutely brilliant. Some of the new Space Marine ones are also excellent, and you can find a bunch of really cool ones all over the Astra Militarum kits and the Votann kits. You know what? They're just doing a great job with transfers lately, and I think it's such an easy way, once you get the technique down, to add loads of flair and character to your models without having to spend hours on freehand if you don't want to. Of course, it's important to protect those transfers afterwards, so I'm using some contrast medium here just to make sure that they don't look too much like transfers and they look a little bit more painted on. Next up, I highlighted the banner with a little bit of an off-white, and that's done. As mentioned, I added one more transfer to the top so I could have another cool red stripe. Again, red and green aren't really heavily present on this model, but they're excellent spot colours and they contrast the white and blue really nicely. Now, with the transfers done that make him look like he's part of loads of different Imperial armies and is going to be an excellent ally, I went onto the base and started with the Sisters side of the base that matches my Adeptus Sororitas army. Starting with a dry brush of field blue all over the black base coat, I then went in with a highlight of Fenrisian grey, and for painting, that side of the base was done. Now for the lava side of the base, there's a few steps to this, but it's really quite easy to have cool looking lava, starting with base coating it in white. Whilst that dries, we're going to add a little bit more flair to the rest of the base in the form of a nice little tree. I've had these trees from Woodland Scenics for a while, and they're too small really to be used as scenery on the gaming table. So I'm going to rip this one up and make it look like a little sapling that's losing its leaves in autumn. I started by ripping out a bunch of the leaves and leaving most of the structure behind, and then putting Mod Podge all over the top before using the autumn leaf litter from Green Stuff World and sprinkling that over the Mod Podge and leaving it to dry. I painted the trunk without primer, just a bit of Black Legion contrast paint, and later I'll go back and add some brown to it, just so it doesn't look too much like a plastic tree sat there. I drilled a little hole into the base and slotted the tree directly in. Then I added a bit of leaf litter using the exact same stuff and some Mod Podge around it to make it look like it's been losing its leaves over the last couple of days. Technically I should have waited to do the leaves and done it after this next step because leaves fall on top of things, but it didn't really matter. I just avoided putting all these lovely flowers right where the leaves were. These purple heather flowers are from Amazon or somewhere, some model train company, I don't really know, but all the other flowers that you're going to see are from Gamer Grass, and again, one I really recommend. Some really cool hobby supplies that really amp up bases. And as you can see with the amount of colour that's starting to be added, it's such an easy way to make something look really cool. Now, I wasn't going to add this, but because as I was painting this guy, the new Blood Angels were announced, I just had to add the winged blood drop to his little leg, so of course he can ally with my Blood Angels. The idea was that he was always going to be able to team up with them, but I wasn't going to necessarily allude to it quite like I had with the other three factions on here, but when GW announced new Blood Angels, which they haven't done for a very long time whilst you're painting a big old knight, you gotta celebrate it. Back to the lava, I'm using some Eandan yellow and then a little bit of Gryph-hound orange to blend that into the shoreline. Lava will be brighter near the center of it and darker near the shore, and this is all I needed to do to make some really convincing looking lava. The next step was to tidy up the base and then take this guy outside and spray him with some matte varnish, which protects all the paintwork I've done and also seals in those transfers to make them look even more like they've been painted on. Once that was all dry, I added some UV resin and I made sure to put this all over the lava to give it a really cool glossy shiny fluid effect. It's important to do this after the varnish step, otherwise you'll end up with a bunch of matte varnish over your glossy surface and you'll have just wasted your time. I unfortunately am an idiot and do this to myself all the time. However, I put this on, spread it about with a toothpick, and then used a UV torch, which is a bit like a black light in the fact that it is a black light, and made sure everything dried up because it dries either 20 minutes in the sun or 4 minutes under the torch. The final thing to do was add a little bit of gloss varnish on those lenses that are visible to the outside to make them look shiny on such a big model, and we were done. I had an absolute blast making this video and an even better time making the model. I am genuinely so pleased with the result, though I really struggled to show it off to you guys because he's so big, my backdrop, which is just right now made up of a bunch of pieces of A4 paper, couldn't fit him in. But anyway, hopefully it conveys how cool he looks, and you can always check out the thumbnail or my Instagram for a bunch of more in detail pictures and videos. Thank you so much for watching one of the most detailed, in-depth and longest videos I've made on this channel to date. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to doing more like it. I've got a Baneblade on the horizon. As always, I've been Sam. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.